Okay, back to our look at the Industrial Revolution. When we last had our ed puzzles, we talked about what life was like before the revolution. We talked about the early industries. We talked about the domestic system. We talked about the causes of the Industrial Revolution, why it happened in Europe, why it happened in Great Britain, the growth of the textile industries. And we did a lot of this person invented this, and this does this, and this is why it's important. We talked about the rise of the factory system. We, again, did a lot of this does this. We looked at society and how that was changed by the Industrial Revolution, particularly that of the middle class. We talked about the values of the working class. And then we began talking about how disgruntled workers began to make a shift and a play in order to sort of balance out the power structure that was in existence. In class, we will talk about all the different ideas for types of government that could exist that arise out of this desire to change the way that society is, not only in Great Britain, but also because the Industrial Revolution takes place in more than just Europe. It also takes place in, we'll look at it in Latin America to some extent. We'll look at it in Russia, which is, Europe and Asia, and it also occurs in the United States as well. So now we're going to pick up, and in theory, we're going to pick up, maybe. We'll just go, hopefully it'll show up. So political and social reforms. So these are looking at specific reforms that do occur, not just theories of what should happen, but what actually does happen. You need to know the theories about why people think these should happen and the reasons why they think that they should happen. And then you want to actually know, here's what really does happen. So there are changes within the Industrial Revolution that leads to a new worker class. This group isn't represented by the government, thus the laws that are passed aren't passed in their benefit, because people in government, while ideally they should be representing everybody within the area that they claim to represent, that's not always the case. They're not always working for the best interest of everyone. A lot of times it tends to be a smaller group of people. And so, but particularly a lot of people in this new working class did not have the right to vote in Great Britain, and they really felt that they should have the right to vote. And this isn't just women. So they demand changes in not only social reforms, but also government reforms. So the Reform Act of 1832. In the early 1800s, only those allowed to vote in Parliament were male property owners. So if you didn't own property, then you didn't get to have vote for a representative in Parliament, which most of the population were not property owners. We talked about how there was the common land and they had been using the common land for grazing, and then it gets cut off, and that's why people began moving to the city. Newly populated areas that came up and their population greatly increased because of the Industrial Revolution, for example, like Manchester, they didn't have representation in government at all, and they were mainly working class. If you were Jewish, if you were Catholic, and other sorts of minority groups, you were restricted from holding public offices, period. And so you can pretty much be assured that those people in public office weren't really looking out for you. So the Parliament in Great Britain has the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The House of Commons is similar to the House of Representatives in the United States. At that point, it was an unpaid position, so only the wealthy could really afford to hold office, because anyone else can't afford, have your career be volunteer work. And so a lot of people felt like it defeated the purpose of having a House of Commoners if the House of Commoners wasn't made up of commoners, it was just made up of wealthy people. They said, it's pretty much just an extension of the House of Lords. It's not representing the working class and the lower middle class, their best interests. So the working and the middle class are led by political liberals, do not associate political terms that we use in the United States necessarily with the political terms used for Great Britain. It's led by political liberals, and they began to demand change, and they really began pressuring Parliament, and Parliament agrees to pass the Reform Act in 1832. This is just showing you a map of England in case you don't know what England looks like. So the Reform Act of 1832 gave industrial cities representation where they did not have it before in the House of Commons. It also gave voting rights to middle-class men who owned a certain amount of property. They still didn't give voting rights to all males. They're still trying to really regulate who can voting. And they felt that, and this was an opinion that was held by the writers of the U.S. Constitution way back in the late 1700s, that the common man just didn't have enough information to make an educated vote or who should represent them, so they didn't. They were excluded from that. Women obviously were excluded. The Factory Act. While Parliament debated the Reform Act, there is a member that began investigating the treatment of children in British textile factories. Now, the issue of child labor comes up in the United States, it comes up in Great Britain, and there's this idea that it's probably not a good idea for your 10-year-old or your 6-year-old or your 12-year-old to do that kind of work. It's not really the good for them to work 60 some hours a day. And so there's an effort to really look into this and think about what we can do to change things. How can we improve upon this? And so Michael Sadler is the guy that's credited with really looking at and showing Parliament, here's the bad things that are going on in government, and they reported the long hours, low wages, etc. It results in the Factory Act, and it limits the amount of working hours that kids can do. So it says that it's illegal for teenagers to work more than 12 hours per day, and children between the ages of 9 to 13 had to receive 2 hours of schooling per day. You see this effort of making education compulsory, which means you have to go, as a way to combat child labor. Because if the kids are in school and they're required to go to school, then they can't be working. What I think is really interesting is that it's okay for a teenager to work 10 hours a day or 11 hours a day. They just can't work 12. It's just too much. So it's a step in the right direction, but there's still some things going on. These are just images of child labor. And some of these are from the United States as well. So you've got a lot of these are children that are in the coaling industry, or you have kids that are in the textile industry. This little adorable boy is a chimney sweep, has no shoes. All right, so in 1833, Parliament abolished slavery in all the British Empire. We've mentioned this before, just wanted to bring it up again. It's done over a period of 4 years. Slaves over the age of 6 are only partially free until their time period is up. And slave owners are compensated by the British government because slaves technically were still seen as property. But you want to note that in all of the British Empire, which is a massive amount of territory, it's not just the country of Great Britain, it's everything that Great Britain owns, they're getting rid of slavery by 1833. We noted that the U.S. and Brazil are the last to do that. U.S. 1865, Brazil even later. It's still a major issue for the U.S. in 1833. We haven't even fought the Civil War. Just very quick, let's look at women. If you see the word suffrage or you see the word enfranchisement, they mean the same thing, voting. So the word suffrage and the word enfranchisement is voting. You have the right to vote. Women are not seen as equal to men. They are not allowed to own property. They are also not the legal guardians of their children. You really have very, very little rights. It is all given to the man. So let's say that, for example, a woman needed to flee a very bad situation. Her children legally are bound to her husband. She has no claim over them. Many women really felt like, just like workers felt like, if they could get the right to vote, then they could increase their power in society. This is the same argument that's made by the suffragettes in the United States. Women can't serve on juries because they're not, in order to serve on a jury, you have to be registered to vote. So they're not tried by a jury of their peers. They don't have an influence in the law, yet they're told to follow the laws if they're small children. And so women felt like, we are citizens of this country. We deserve the right to vote just like everyone else. There's no reason why we shouldn't. They are seen as extremely radical. Even a lot of women really felt that women didn't have the brains nor the need to vote. Your husbands are going to tell you what your opinion is. You don't need to have one. You don't need to worry about that. But the suffragists, not only in Great Britain and in Europe, but also in the United States, continue to work and push the idea of women having the right for suffrage. So change begins in the early 1900s. In Europe, it's the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, led by Emmeline Pankhurst. The government continues to ignore women. A lot of suffragists are sent to prison. By 1918, women in Great Britain over the age of 30 are given the right to vote. In 1919, or the 19th Amendment, which takes effect in 1920, women in the United States are given the right to vote. And they're given the same rights just off the bat. However, in Great Britain, it takes until 1928 for women to have the same voting rights as men. So this is kind of unrelated to the Industrial Revolution, but I really felt like I needed to include it in there also. So I'm just going to throw it in there and we'll see what happens. After the end of Napoleon, France puts Louis XVIII back on the throne. The French legislature had they had a legislature, but most of the power rests with the king. So it's technically like a limited monarchy, but the monarchy's not really limited. So Louis XVIII dies, and his brother Charles X takes the throne, and he tries to rule as an absolute monarch. Like he tries to completely avoid Parliament and not listen to them or legislature at all. And citizens are like, we revolted once, we will do it again. Don't try us. And so that ends up leading to a revolution in 1830 when rebels once again take over Paris. Charles flees to Great Britain and he abdicates or gives up the throne because he basically doesn't want to have his head cut off. People were afraid that this would lead to another mass revolution throughout Europe. In the Congress of Vienna, the remnants of that, like, we've already dealt with all this. Let's fix it, France. Stop being a problem child. So Congress decides that they're going to officially create a constitutional monarchy. They choose Louis Philippe as the new king, and he's called the Citizen King because even though he was wealthy, people believe he really acted like regular people, and they like that. This changes over time, and he acts like any other king because let's face it, we may come into the throne thinking like we're the regular old Joe, but once you get all that power and all that stuff, you're going to start acting very bougie. So that happens. They increased the number who could vote, but only those who could vote who would vote for him. So he's like, hey, we're going to increase male suffrage. We're going to allow more people to vote, but we're going to be really particular about who we allow to vote because we only want people that are going to vote for me. They also protect the power of the government over the people. He decides to limit some of the free press. He silences those who oppose him. And you see the poor getting poorer and the rich getting richer. And in the end, Louis Philippe, who starts off as the Citizen King, becomes very unpopular because he once again tries to increase the power of the monarchy while limiting the power of the people. And that's what they're not for. So you know what we have to have? Another revolution. So in the Revolution of 1848, the French government prevents a banquet that was going to be planned for a lot of reformers because they didn't want them all getting together and that causing drama. So the citizens begin to protest. Once again, the king abdicates because we learned from Louis XVI what could happen. A new government is formed. It is a republic with a president, and they elect Louis Napoleon, who is Napoleon's nephew. Yes, that Napoleon. And he's known as Napoleon III. The era is known as the Second Republic. The First Republic is considered the time between the French Revolution and the reign of Napoleon, 1792 to 1804. So the Second Republic comes after the Revolution of 1848, when Louis Napoleon, or Napoleon III, is placed on the throne, and he is the leader of their republic, and he's like the president of France. All right, and what I'm hoping is going to be somewhat quick, we're going to look at industrialization and revolution within Russia from the years of 1950 to 1914, but I'm actually not going to go that far because then that puts us into period 6, and we're not about that yet. All right, they still had an absolute monarchy. That's the Tsar Nicholas I. They have no national parliament. They have no political parties. They have no nationwide elections. Russian society is dominated by the boyars. Remember, that's the titled nobility. The Russian serfs still exist until 1861 when they're finally set, free. So they're no longer serfs, but they're still super poor, so that's not going to change. In the U.S., social and economic changes always come from society as people seek new opportunities and rights. We see that in some degree in Great Britain. In Russia, because nobody else really has any rights and the state is super powerful, and the nobles are kind of okay with that because they're given their rights by the state, change has to come with the government itself. And so that's a different, when we look at Russia, we want to note that the change within Russia, social change, economic change, all that comes when the government itself initiates the change. They had done a lot to try to catch up and become very powerful. They wanted to follow what they had seen in Western Europe, and we looked at that. We even looked at that with Peter the Great. So we've already talked about Peter the Great. We've talked about Catherine the Great, so I'm going to skip them because you know them. We've talked about the Crimean War. So let's look at Russian industrialization. In 1890s, the Industrial Revolution has now spread to Russia, and they are industrializing just like everyone else. So they're building factories. They're taking advantage of the new inventions. They're taking advantage of electricity. They're really focusing on railroads, which means they're using a lot of the Bessemer process. Remember, the Bessemer process is the way to make steel cheaply. That's chill is when you put still and cheaply in one word, but they make steel cheaper and faster. By 1900, Russia ranks fourth in the world in steel production. They also had major industries in coal, textiles, which is cloth, and oil. So they catch up, and they catch up fast. And the state feels like in order to make Russia powerful in the world, they need to make these changes because otherwise they're going to get passed by. So what happens out of that? Well, there's a growing middle class made of businessmen and professionals. So like we saw in Great Britain, not just landed people with titles. These are people who worked their way up and became very wealthy and had a lot of power within their business themselves. A lot of them didn't want a czar. They didn't like the way that the Tsarist Russia was governed, with the czar having so much power. They wanted a role in political life because they felt like they've really risen through the ranks, that they should be able to say that. But the middle class is also dependent upon the government for contracts, for jobs, and for also dealing with radical, crazy workers who might upset factory production, because the state's really dominating all of that, and that's how those things are happening. They need the government to approve those things. Factory workers, it's about 5% of Russia's total population, because by and large, Russia is still very agricultural. Same harsh working conditions, 13 hours days, super ruthless discipline, constant disrespect from supervisors. The same working conditions that we saw in Great Britain, they're almost upped in Russia. They often lived in unsanitary barracks very close to the factories, so there was no reason for them not to get to work. They're not allowed to make unions or political parties. It's a way to keep them down and subservient, and any time protest is suggested, it is very quickly smacked down. Many of the workers begin to, and a lot of educated Russians begin to turn toward Marxist socialism. They really feel like it's answering what they need. And in 1898, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party is created. It is actually not democratic at all, and it is very much socialist. And by 1905, the Russian Revolution, which we will come to study as the Bolshevik Revolution, is full on. So when we look at the Industrial Revolution in Russia, we want to look at how it parallels to Great Britain and how it's different. In Great Britain, eventually these reforms are taking place without a lot of revolution and hubbub. In Russia, that's not going to occur because the state is so powerful and works so hard to prevent that from occurring. Now, I really am hoping that this is less than 20 minutes because I can't tell. But look at that, 17 minutes. My goal was 15. I'm a winner. I hope you enjoy this. At least you listen to it. Make sure you're paying attention. Make sure you're taking good notes. Make sure you are reading. Very important. We will finish this up tomorrow. I can sense your excitement already. Ready.